On April 25th, the New York Times ran a front-page story called "States Seek Limits on Robocalls in Campaigns." The piece begins with a very vivid description of what these robocalls were like. This is state-line Lincoln, Nebraska. State investigators here are still trying to figure out who sabotaged Scott+Kleeb's campaign for Congress last November with a barrage of automated telephone calls to voters. The unauthorized calls, officials said, distorted Mr. Kleeb's views and even used a recording of his voice, sometimes arriving in the middle of the night with the greeting, "Hi, this is Scott+Kleeb." Now, the point of the story is that lawmakers all around the country are responding to intense grassroots revulsion and mounting legislative efforts to kind of do away with these kinds of calls. Several Nebraska state lawmakers, for instance, were so outraged by the shenanigans that they are pushing legislation that would impose some of the country's most restrictive regulations on pre-recorded campaign calls, both bogus and legitimate ones. They mentioned similar bills in Florida, Michigan, Missouri, Wisconsin, and at least a dozen other states. Indeed, robocalls were a serious problem in the 2006 elections, and I have to say I'm very pleased to see the New York Times front page a story on this important subject. But what's odd about the Times' treatment of this story is that it's entirely unclear from it who's doing the robocalling and who isn't. Now, the third paragraph of the piece has a quote, "Get rid of them," said Stan Jordan, a Republican state representative in Jacksonville, Florida, who has sponsored a bill there. He says, "When they first started, this wasn't much of a nuisance, but it's epidemic level now." Now that clearly gives us the impression that robocalls must have been a bipartisan problem. Both parties were doing it, and here we have a sort of righteous bipartisan or Republican effort to somehow solve the problem. Well, as it happens, in every case that we know of, the robocalls were made by and on behalf of Republicans. Scott+Kleeb, who was running for the House from Nebraska, was running as a Democrat. The piece mentions Missouri. In Missouri, voters endured a blitz of automated calls during the tight Senate race between jim+talent, the Republican incumbent, and claire+mccaskill, the Democrat who unseated him. Then the piece goes on to quote the Missouri Attorney General, what they're going to do about this. Every account from Missouri makes abundantly clear that it was Talent's campaign that was sending the robocalls. The robocalls are meant both to harass and confuse voters. They are a form of black propaganda, which means that they are disguised to make it look as if they come from the other side. So what you do is you infuriate people by pestering them to death, calling them in the middle of the night, waking them up, but you're supposedly the Democrat who's doing this. This is a really underhanded but entirely typical kind of Republican campaign tactic. Let me reemphasize that. A Republican campaign tactic. Now, I've talked about this before, this issue of the difference between voter fraud and election fraud. The voter fraud is somebody voting more than once or voting in the wrong precinct deliberately. It's very small scale activism. Election fraud is far more organized. The party is behind it. It's meant to cancel out the votes of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. It's much more effective. Well, robocalls are, in fact, a form of Republican election fraud. Now, the piece seems to me to be of interest primarily because it promises to open up the investigation or the subject of election fraud so that we're not talking only about robocalls per se, which are indeed obnoxious, but which represent only one of a whole range of tricks and tactics that have been used to subvert American democracy. That purpose of opening the field to further inquiry is defeated if we don't just face the fact that one party engaged in the practice and the other was victimized for it and often sat still for it. So basically what we're saying is this. Election fraud, voter fraud, both of them are nothing new. They've both been around forever. Historically, both parties have engaged in fraud. The Democrats are no angels. I'm from Chicago, so I think I ought to know. But it is also true that since 2000, since the Bolshevik Revolution started, these kinds of tricks and tactics have been played exclusively by Republicans. The Democrats are guilty of staying mute about this sort of malfeasance. So if we're going to clean the system up, we got to call a spade and recognize that one of the two major parties now is subversive of American democracy. And the only way we can do that is to talk about episodes like this openly and honestly.